Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V-Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. A week from this Saturday, we tee it up for real as reigning Big Ten and national champions. This is an important week of practice as starting positions and the depth chart will be solidified. Joining us on our game day segment today with his thoughts on the latest news will be Isaiah Hole from USA Today's WolverinesWire. At his presser last week, Sharon said, "As long as I'm here, we'll have a great offensive line. This year, we'll have 5 new starters and a lot of young guys in the 2 deep. The starters, although they're new, most of them have logged plenty of snaps the last few years. They just need to come together, and that can take time." Miles Hinton says right now, it's all about finding an identity as a unit.
Everybody in the room, I feel like is really good. Freshmen coming in are really good players. The guys returning are good players. The depth is still there for sure. I feel like this year's O-line, it'll just be about finding our identity as a unit.
Giovanni El-Hadi said trust will be the key ingredient with this new starting 5.
We have a standard. We have to withhold that standard and exceed that standard every day. You want to be comfortable. You want to be comfortable with the guy next to you. You want to be comfortable and trust them if you're going to pass off a twist or pass off somebody and be able to come back, knowing the guy got your back and you got his back.
Northwestern transfer Josh Preeb says since he's arrived in Ann Arbor, the O-line has worked hard and they are starting to gel.
I'm new. We got a lot of guys who are trying to figure out how to play together. And I think just as a unit, we've been gelling so much better together. Our communication's been on point, and really we're just playing 5 as one.
Preeb said he is working hard not only to be a leader in the offensive line room, but a team leader as well.
You know, certainly I've embraced that role more since the spring, and have kind of earned the younger guys and the guys in that room earn their respect, and I think I'm comfortable in that role, and I think I can definitely be one of the leaders on the team.
My guest today says he has high expectations for Team 145. He says the drop-off won't be what many analysts expect, but the key to how good this team can be will be steady, efficient play from the quarterback position. Joining us next is Isaiah Hole from USA Today's WolverinesWire. So stay with us. Back with us today to talk about what's coming up. The start of the season is Isaiah Hole from WolverinesWire. Great to have you back with us, Isaiah.
Of course, that's the only time I ever get the text being like, "Hey, can you come on?" I know I say this every time, but like I can spare like 45 minutes to an hour for you. Anyone else ask me, even if it's like a close friend, like, "Hey, can you come on the podcast for 20 minutes?" I'm like, "Oh," but this, I always look forward to coming on with you.
Well, we appreciate that. We love having you on. And of course, we're going to get you back on during the season, which is right around the corner. Before we talk about the season, though, let's start with some great recruiting news from the other day. 4-star wideout Andrew Marsh from Katy, Texas, gave his verbal to Michigan. I guess it's not a surprise he was trending that way, but you never know. We'll see if it holds. But this kid seems to be that big game changer type we've wanted, doesn't he?
Well, I mean, this is the highest rated wide receiver Michigan's gotten since the ballyhooed 2017 class, since Donovan Peoples-Jones. Donovan Peoples-Jones and Oliver Martin were the last 2 highly rated wide receivers that Michigan's brought in. And this guy's right up there, ranked anywhere between 60 and 130-ish or something. If you look at the 4 recruiting services and the 2 composites and all of that, and obviously, he's a multifaceted player. He's got the speed. He's got kind of everything you are looking for. He could be that guy that replaces Roman Wilson and maybe take it a couple steps further once he arrives on campus. But it was funny because I was talking to my best friend about this earlier today. And he doesn't follow recruiting, so I had to kind of explain to him all of this. But it was like, okay, Michigan has long thought that they were getting him, right? Going back to at least the end of June, that last once he decided he was going to visit Michigan and not Oklahoma, suddenly it was like, okay, now it's going to likely be Michigan. And only could the Michigan fan base have that complete meltdown that it had yesterday when all of a sudden Steve Wiltfong and then everyone else was like, oh, Washington's in play here. And it sounds like it's legit, and maybe and it was one of those things where even I was refreshing what other people were saying because I wasn't going to contact Andrew directly because he was the only one that I had really any contact with in his recruitment. So I was like, okay, I can understand why Michigan fans are being like that. I remember before I got in the media, being a fan and following recruiting and the Deshaun hand of it all. I remember very specifically Mike Farrell, he was that Rivals then, being like, Michigan's going to be very happy by the end of the day. And I felt like, okay, here it is. And then only to tune in and see him pick Alabama. I get it. I remember those moments, and I know that lives in the collective consciousness of Michigan fans. But, I mean, what's a big recruitment without a little drama? Because we don't have much drama these days. No. You know, usually when a kid puts out a top 5 list or a top 4 or whatever, we usually pretty much have a good idea of where he's going. It's very rare that you don't, and even when you don't, you still kind of think a little bit. There's very few surprises. So I think that was just stirring up a little drama. I kind of had that feeling that just to make it so it's like, okay, now he's got his moment a little bit more, because when it's a foregone conclusion, even if you're a 5-star at this point, it's a 5-star and it's a foregone conclusion, I think that like it's not the same as it used to be maybe like 7-8 years ago, when it doesn't really matter. They commit and it dominates the news cycle. I think that that's kind of changed. So it's good for Michigan to have him in the fold. Now they've got 2 wide receivers, the other one being 4-star Jacob Washington. You would have liked to have had the 3-star Phillip Wright still there, who flipped to LSU. But nonetheless, at least they've got 2 guys that I would imagine they're going to try to find 1 or 2 more still. It's going to be a little harder at this stage. But obviously they were trying for Jerome Miles, and he eliminated Michigan just a few days ago. But, there's certainly other options out there that they could try to flip. And it will be interesting to see what they're able to do, but they do definitely need to continue to bring in some wideout talent, because they only brought in 2 last year. It's been kind of a thin wide receiver group each of the last 3 years, and then the year before, you've seen a couple guys leave, so it's good to get a high-end guy like Marsh. Now they just need to use him, because that's been kind of the issue. And the unfortunate thing about the state of college football is guys want to play right away, and I know that Sharon Moore said the other day that the further away from the ball you are, the more you tend to be ready earlier. I don't necessarily find that to be true when it comes to wide receivers. It seems more often than not those guys are year 2 guys. More, I think you're more likely to see running backs and maybe even tight ends get some early run. Tight ends not so much at Michigan because they're just deep, but I think that you're more often likely to see a lot of other positions, whereas wide receiver might get in for a couple plays, but they're not going to generally be big factors until year 2. So you got to be able to keep him happy, keep him through the year 2, and then hope that he can see the field early. But, I mean, maybe he breaks in early. If he's the type of player that I think he might be, maybe he does play in year 1. Well,
I just wanted to get that good recruiting news out of the way first. Talk about this year's team now. Earlier this week, you did a piece in WolverinesWire about what 24/7 sports analyst Clint Brewster's preseason take was on Michigan, which was, in a nutshell, if Michigan does one thing well, it could win a second straight national championship. Talk about what that thing is, and do you agree with his take?
First off, shout out to Clint. I mean, former coworker back in the Wolverine 24/7 days, like kind of usurped his job a little bit, but he actually, I think, is thriving more in his role of being an analyst as a former quarterback and in college and having that skill set. But because of the way he looks at the game, that's why I have a lot more respect for him and his opinion, which I don't know if I 100% agree with him, but I agree with the spirit of it, that if Michigan gets consistent quarterback play from, and you said Alex Orji, so I'm going to take that to actually mean Alex Orji, not just if Michigan gets consistent quarterback play from whoever it gets, whoever is in the room. I think Alex Orji is in particular the special one there. That if they get consistent quarterback play, then Michigan's his pick to win the national championship. I think Alex Orji is the fulcrum for Michigan this year. I look at a lot of different players and say that that's maybe an inflection player for their group. Like I talk about Kendrick Bell, for instance, and like he is a player that if he comes on this year and suddenly plays like his brother, then at the very least, then the wide receiving core is gone from like an unknown to maybe just a okay stable to an incredible position group. Alex Orji's a couple steps beyond that because he's a quarterback and because he also has a lot of capability beyond just merely, dropping back and passing the ball. We know he can run and we know he has great vision. It'll be interesting to see if he is in fact the starting quarterback, how much Michigan does run him, because remember J.J. McCarthy in his first year, he was coming in almost solely for run plays and occasionally he'd pass. And then we would not really see any designed runs for J.J. after that. Once he won the starting job, he'd scramble or take off when he saw something, but it was rare that he had design runs. So if Michigan looks at Orji and says, you're the quarterback, we're going to use the full extent of your capability in throwing and running, and he's able to consistently make good decisions when he is throwing, then the offense is suddenly gone from being like this veritable unknown. Everyone's looking at it and saying, like, good luck being 130th in the country, Michigan offense. People are looking at it with all of the turnover as if this is Iowa any given year. Whereas I think it's kind of funny because I understand Jalen Milroe is a much higher rated recruit, but Jalen Milroe struggled mightily for a while. Even when he was when Bryce Young was injured, I remember listening to a lot of those games, and Jalen Milroe sounded like a liability. And then even early last year, Jalen Milroe felt like a liability for Alabama. And then suddenly something clicked. Maybe it was him getting benched against USF. I don't know. Something clicked, and he turned it on, and now he's looked at as one of the top players in college football. Alex Orji is almost a clone of Jalen Milroe. So I think part of the question is does he come out and look like a liability early? And if he does, what do you do to kind of get him to be consistent? If you can get that worked out and can get it so he's I used to think 60% was the benchmark for passers. I think now it's probably more 70%. If you can get him to be about a 70% passer, and you don't necessarily even need him to throw 25 times a game. It might even just be 15 based off of all the stuff you can do with the running backs and even using the wide receivers in different ways, end arounds and reverses and such and so forth. But I think because you have a defense that a lot of people are really underrating for some reason. I understand they're saying like top 5, top 10. I still think that's underrating this Michigan defense. You have this defense. You've got all of these different guys that theoretically should be really good. The offensive line, despite new faces, should still be among the best in the Big Ten, if not all of college football.
Rolling back to the quarterback question, as you were talking about Alex Orji, Michigan fans that we hear from all the time want to know who the starting quarterback is. And we got a little bit of a tease, I think, when BTN was in town this week about Davis Warren and Alex Orji competing, seemed to be the top two. But do you think there's really any good reason for Sharon to say before Fresno State, yeah, Alex is the guy?
No, because I think you want to see it in game. That's kind of what I was getting to, is because the quarterback position is the singular thing that's going to determine, I think, how far Michigan can go. And I think Alex Orji brings you the furthest, but that doesn't mean he's the most consistent early. Because if Alex is throwing and maybe he's making big plays. This is kind of the thing that's always been heard about him in practice. And this was kind of similar to JJ, though. He makes 2 or 3 really wow plays, and then he makes 1 or 2 boneheaded plays. So if Davis Warren ends up being more consistent, let's say it's the difference between Alex Orji's passing for 65%, but has got like a 3-to-2 ratio of wow to boneheaded plays. But Davis Warren is passing for 70%, but has very few wow plays, and which is kind of what I would have expected from a healthy Jack Tuttle, for instance. Then I think you just got to put him in the game and see how that balances out, because some guys just play better with the lights turned on. We've only seen Alex Orji attempt 1 pass in an actual game. We've seen more from Davis Warren, and while he's looked good in spring games, when he's come in as a reserve at the end of games, hasn't necessarily been as impressive. So I think that you might want to just see it. And you might see both in Fresno State, depending on the ebb and flow of that game. And maybe, even see a dinged up Jack Tuttle. Who knows? So I think that you want to kind of see how that works and just kind of see how everything's going, because there's really no point in fully saying, that's your quarterback, because you want to keep things as mysterious for Texas in week 2. This is where the schedule, it's good and it's bad. It's bad because there's a lot of really difficult teams. It seems like literally every other week, right? Week 2, Texas. Week 4, USC. Week 6, Washington. In the month of October, it takes a little bit of a dip, but Illinois is on the road. That's going to be, a difficult one just because they tend to be. Michigan State's a rivalry game. The week after that, Oregon. Then at the end of November, obviously Ohio State. So you never really get a stretch where you get to just kind of coast. Not that Michigan ever coasts, as Sharon Moore would tell you, but you have a little bit more of an opportunity, have had more of an opportunity the last couple of years. Think to 2022. There's no way that they'd be sitting there saying, all right, well, Cade's the starting quarterback for week 1, JJ for week 2, with a schedule like this one, right? You're afforded that luxury when you have teams on the schedule that you're like, well, all we have to do is show up and we should win that game. They don't have that luxury this year. But the good thing is it pushes everyone to have to do that much more in fall camp in order to just be able to get to this point where, okay, we can, in order for us to be able to contend against the Texas or a USC, you guys got to step things up so far, so fast, because we've only got maybe 1 game where you both can get in and figure it out. And whoever does better that game, maybe, or whoever shows us what we need to see in that game, you get to start in week 2. And then we're just going to stay with that person, because we don't have the luxury of just constantly pulling guys in and and trying to figure out who does better in games. So I think that is actually a good thing, because it just kind of forces the competition to be that much more heightened. And it'll be interesting. It'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. I still would put my money on Alex Orji. I wouldn't bet my house on it, but I would certainly put my money on him.
A lot of speculation about whether Wink Martindale is going to, change the defense much. We've heard he's blitz crazy. One thing we do know is a guy coming from 20 years in the league knows what the heck he's doing, doesn't he?
It's only college football fans that seem to have this. I won't limit it to Michigan fans. It's college football fans that seem to have this kind of mentality of college is better than pro, and I understand that from what do you prefer to watch more?
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, it's there's always a knock when a guy comes from like the NFL, and Mike McDonald got the same thing, right? When he was hired, Jesse Minter even though he had a year at Vanderbilt, where it's like, oh, well, he comes from the NFL, he hasn't been in the college game for X amount of years or whatever. It's like, do you understand that it's a completely different beast in the NFL because they have to go they're not getting like weeks off. Like the worst team in the NFL would wallop the best college team by like 7 touchdowns. Like that's just how good the NFL is. So with Wink, it's really funny when you hear all of this, like, well, who knows if he's going to be able to blah, blah, blah. It's like, bro had to go up against Lamar Jackson in practice at his peak. He's had to defend some of the best of the best every single week. And he's the one that's kind of had the answers. I understand it didn't look incredible with the Giants. But just because it didn't look incredible with the Giants, I mean, it's the Giants. The Giants have been kind of, especially defensively, it's been a kind of a wayward son for a little while.
Yeah.
But I mean, if Michigan would have hired Wink Martindale in 2021 instead of Mike McDonald, or in 2022, everyone would have been losing their minds because he was considered the top defensive coordinator in the NFL. And the only reason why wasn't considered that was because his acolytes, like Mike McDonald, like Jesse Minter, like even the ones that are in the college level, like D'Anton Lynn, have thrived. So it's become kind of a thing where Martindale, even though this was like I understand he didn't invent this system, but it was his system that was being emulated in Michigan. And I don't think you're going to see any changes in terms of the scheme. I think what we'll see, as you mentioned, the blitz heavy thing, you might see some changes in terms of play calling and deployment of said scheme. But he's going to have a lot more answers. Like, he's a much more seasoned defensive coordinator than even like a Jim Knowles, who everyone goes gaga over. He's a much more seasoned guy. He knows how to get the most out of who he has and what he can do with it. So will Michigan be a little bit more blitz heavy? I mean, it's possible. I mean, he's even said, like, listen, those things were situational. Like we were doing some of these things because we felt like that was the best way to win those games. But that doesn't mean that's what we're going to do. I don't know that he's necessarily going to need to be blitz heavy with what he's got, because look at the front four that Michigan has.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't really necessarily need to blitz if you're able to collapse the pocket with the guys you have in the interior, and you have 2 edge rushers who I think are highly underrated in Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore. I mean, we saw what both of those guys looked like by the end of the season. Obviously those 4 guys, the whole front were the guys that Michigan trusted. Jesse Minter trusted last year to be on the field for the final play and the biggest play in maybe Michigan history. And those were the 4 that were counted on, and they were the 4 that made the play. So I think that you don't necessarily need to blitz a lot. Now, if he's unnecessarily blitzing a lot and it ends up causing some problems, then maybe it's a different scenario. But blitzes have been built into the system. People like to say Jesse Minter didn't like to blitz, but he blitzed. Unfortunately, against TCU, he blitzed a lot, and it didn't work. But there were blitzes against Alabama. It's all about situationally. Will Wink be does he have that feel for what's the right call against these teams at the right time? And that's, I think, more the question. And considering he's been a DC for a long time, he's been at the highest level, he's coached some of the best defenses in the NFL, I'm not particularly concerned about it. As a matter of fact, the way I look at it is this maybe got better. As good as Jesse Minter and Mike McDonald have been, and it's allowed them to find promotion, go to the NFL and move up the ladder here. I mean, Martindale's got something to prove because he wasn't fielding a lot of NFL offers there. goes back down to college, and everyone's telling him like you're kind of washed up. But he's got the personnel, and I do agree with you. I think he's got the knowledge. It's just a matter of will he make the right play calls at the right time? Because yes, in any game, one or two bad play calls can completely sink your season. But if he does still have that knack, then this has the possibility of being an even better Michigan defense than what we've seen in some time.
Oh, I agree completely, and I don't worry 1 second about Wink Martindale and what he's going to do. And the defensive talent he has at his disposal, I think it's another shutdown defense. I know a lot of folks are, maybe not quite sure of that, but from a talent perspective, this defense has everything it's going to take to be dominant once again, don't they?
Yeah, it's funny because I think I only saw snippets of the BTN on campus yesterday. And I think it was like Kenneth Grant who said something like, we don't have the depth we had last year. And he's in the room, so he can say that. But like on paper, they do. On paper, it's about the same as it was last year. So when I look across the board, and I was kind of charting this out on the show on Lockdown Wolverines yesterday. Defensively, it's like there's a whole second defense essentially that if they were on the field, I feel pretty good about. Maybe it's a little inexperienced, and there's certainly some places even in the starting lineup where there's some questions, right? We haven't seen Jair Hill more than like 58 snaps total. So, how is he going to do? But with the transfers they brought in, they really were smart. And even though some of these guys are lower level guys, Amir Hall from Albany, Ricky Johnson from UNLV, some obviously have higher end experience, Wes Walker from Tennessee, Jaden Mangum at MSU, Jay Sean Barham at Maryland. I think that you can kind of look at this and say, no matter which way you go, you've got a whole second defense. And let me just kind of elucidate on that a little bit, because you have your starting four up front, who we've already talked about. I can pick three guys who could be in rotation at defensive tackle and at least on paper feel good about. We know what Rayshon Benny is capable of. We don't necessarily know about Etta, Trey Pierce, and let's add a one to that, who's been on the team forever but hasn't really cracked that lineup, but now is starting. We're hearing that the lights have turned on there. Edge rusher TJ Guy has been the hype beast of the offseason. For me, the question is who's next to him or on the opposite side of him. Cam Brandt is the one that I would pencil in. I think Etta will also split out sometimes. And then outside of that, is it a freshman? Is it Keyshawn Bennett? That's kind of one of the bigger question marks when it comes to the depth. Linebacker with Jay Sean Barham and Ernest Hausman, that could be one of the best duos in the country, let alone the conference. And behind them, I feel pretty good about Jaden Hood and Jimmy Rolder and even freshman Cole Sullivan. And then behind them, the safeties, it's like pick a safety. Any safety, I feel good about them. It's such a deep group because you've got the two transfers, you've got Makari, you've got Quinton. There was a point in the year where we thought that Brendan Hillman was going to be starting, and no one really batted an eye at that. I was like, all right, well, that will probably work out pretty well. And now he's probably fifth on the depth chart.
Yeah.
And then at corner, obviously Will Johnson, and then Jair Hill, and then you've got the two transfers, like I mentioned, and that's where it gets a little murky because you're hoping for a Cody Jones or a Miles Pollard to finally take that step up. That big step forward, and it doesn't necessarily sound like they've fully gotten there. But still, we just went through the entire starting lineup and the depth pieces. And, if you're feeling that entire second group as the defense, it might not be as dominant as the first, but you're like, okay, well, they're not going to just say, all right, first team defense, you're tired, let's sub out all 11 of you. It's going to be like what we've seen is a little bit of a mishmash, hodgepodge, if you will,
yeah,
of the first and second. And I feel really good about pretty much any of those guys being in until kind of proven otherwise. So I do think that they have an incredible amount of depth. And when it comes to the first team, these are all really experienced guys. and most of them were around and played at a high level in the championship run last year. So, there's questions. Second corner, the second rotational guy when it comes to the edge rushing group. But outside of that, it's like I feel pretty comfortable that this is going to be a really, really good group. And not to mention, and here's one of the things, so this is kind of an aside, and this is what I was kind of wargaming here as you called me. Michigan's projected to have 4 first-round picks in the latest ESPN first-round mock draft. 3 of those guys are on defense. How often do you see in modern college football a team have 4 first-round picks, especially on defense like that, and see them kind of just be a middle-of-the-road team or just like a merely good team? I don't think you see that very often. Every now and again, Iowa will get like 1 or 2 guys in the first round, or another team will just have that talent. But if Michigan's going to get those 3 that you expect, Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, drafted in the first round, that probably means that they are absolutely wrecking teams. So, and the same thing goes with Colston Loveland on the offensive side. If he gets that, chances are this is probably a Michigan team that's going to the playoffs, not as a different ESPN writer projects that they'd be going to the Citrus Bowl. Now, listen, I'm not going to complain about going to Orlando at any point in time. I find myself in Orlando at least once a year, but I have a hard time seeing them going there with that kind of talent, specifically with the defensive talent that they have.
Well, moving back over to the offensive side of the ball, we talked about the quarterback situation, but to me, whoever is under center is better when the offensive line is good. A great offensive line covers a multitude of sins. 2 straight Joe Moore award-winning lines, and then last year's unit, which easily could have been. Those are tough acts to follow. But that said, this should be another, from what we're hearing out of camp, another bulldozer man-ball offensive line, shouldn't it?
I think what people are forgetting is who the head coach is, what his specialty is, and the fact that the identity of the team the last 3 years has been the offensive line. I understand defense gets a lot of credit. The J.J. McCarthy gets a lot of credit. Blake Corum was kind of probably the face of the team the last couple of years. But really, the engine that drove Michigan the last 3 years has been the offensive line. Mm-hmm. And in the past, a wholesale change at any position group. You go back to like 1990s or early 2000s when Michigan had everything humming. The late 90s, that is. You didn't really have much trepidation when there was mass turnover, because you knew that the guys that were waiting in the wings were going to be as good and maybe better. I mean, I always think about going from 2003 to 2004 and thinking of like, how are they going to replace Chris Perry? And then it took all of a game before I was like, oh, that's how, like that. And it was always the same thing. It's just like they get guys, you're like, how are they going to replace them? And then the next guy in, was like, oh, okay. Even when it was like a player that maybe didn't look great when they were coming in as an early, getting early playing time as a reserve, like a Stevie Brown type, I remember seeing Stevie Brown in his early downs and just being like, he's such a step down from the starters. And then once he becomes a starter, you're like, oh, okay, let's go. Yeah. I think that what the offensive line people are miscalculating. I see a lot of Buckeye fans in particular saying, well, you're replacing your whole offensive line, it's going to take a step back. Not necessarily, because you think about some of these guys who've been waiting in the wings forever. There's been a lot of guys who have started games. Miles Hinton was the starter at the beginning of the season, and we would have continued to start at the end of the season if he didn't get injured in that Maryland game. I fully believe, especially with some of the struggles that were kind of happening on the right side. I feel like he would have gotten flexed over there. Obviously, Josh Preeb started games and played at a high level at Northwestern. Giovanni El-Hadi started games in 2022 when Trevor Keegan was out. And you didn't miss Trevor Keegan. That should tell you something. It wasn't like they really need to rush Trevor back. They didn't. So, and then who knows with the right side, with the tackle, that's a little bit more of a question because it sounded like it was Andrew Gentry, and Jeff Percy and Evan Link have been kind of giving him a run for his money. Jeff Percy started the Rutgers game and again played at a high level in 2022 when he started that game. So there's a lot of starting experience there. Center doesn't have that in the three-way race there for Raheem Anderson, Greg Crippen, and Dom Judice. But I think that they're going to have, and by all accounts, like it's working out pretty well. They're going to have a good line because the guy at the top is prioritizing that above all things. A former offensive lineman who just got done coaching the offensive line, I think he's got a priority, and they've been recruiting that position at a high level for a long time. And to me, it's a little bit less the starting five and more the depth that starts to concern me, because last year, and they needed to go into the depth a bit last year, but you knew that, okay, if the entire starting five is out, you have an entire second five that you feel good about. They don't have that necessarily. At some positions, yeah, you feel like, okay, whoever wins center, the loser of that battle can probably be a really good backup. Right tackle, same deal. But when it comes to left tackle and the guard spots, like that's where things start to get a little murky, right? Not really sure about the depth there. But when it comes to the starting five and, maybe another 4 players at basically a couple positions, you feel like, all right, they've got depth there. If they want to go 6-7 linemen on the field at a time, they can do that. But beyond 7 or maybe 8 guys, I don't know that you have a full 10 that you think you can go with. But I think that people are underestimating it, and people tend to do that because when they lost like a Ryan Hayes or, heck, going from Andrew Vistardis to Olu to Drake Nugent every year was kind of like the guy leaves and you're like, well, it was a good run that year, but now they've got to have a new center. Let's see how it works out. I know with Olu coming in, it was like, well, they've got an absolute beast there. But I remember last year people were even had a lot of trepidation about Drake Nugent, despite him being on the Remington watch list and being close to being a finalist at Stanford. And yet he still, came in and played pretty incredible ball. I think that they've got a lot working out for them. I would say that if you look at any team and say what position for that team is going to be the best on the team, for Michigan Tech, people like to think it's running back, but it really is offensive line. And it's like you're not going to look at Ohio State and be like, well, how's the receiving corps going to do? They just lost, like coming out of 2021, well, they lost those 3 receivers. No one was sitting there saying, like, they're going to take a big step back. No, you knew that they were going to be really good. So it's kind of the same for Michigan with the offensive line. And I think that it will still be the engine that kind of drives Michigan. And that's a great thing because you've got a stable of running backs that you hope can keep the game consistent from a physical standpoint. And Michigan's not going to turn away from its identity of physicality. Certainly, we know they have it on the defensive side. I don't know why anyone is kind of thinking that it's going to go away on the offensive side.
Well, let's talk about that running back room for just a couple of minutes. I mean, there's so much to be excited about, maybe some question marks on that offense. But the one thing I really want to see is Donovan Edwards getting his chance at being the man. I mean, he's earned that, and I think he's ready for it, don't you?
I do, and I think the hope is, because I said this on SiriusXM yesterday, by virtue of having more volume, that he'll be able to kind of get started a little bit earlier. Because yes, he's had those games where he's busted out big runs early. Obviously, the national championship game, TCU game the year before. But generally, it's taken him a long time to kind of get it going. He's tended to be a guy that's going to get 2 yards, then 3, then 2, then 4, then 7, then 4, then 20, then 30, then 40, then 20. You know, like it's like a lot of people talk about a running back getting into rhythm. That's definitely Donovan. And where last year, that's where it kind of became more of a struggle because he wasn't really ever allowed to get into a rhythm because he was only getting about 5, 6, 7 carries a game. So, which, you know, understandable when people were trying to take away the run, and it just looked like he was being a little hesitant as they, you know, tried to get him to be more patient, wait for his blocks to set up. And it seemed like whenever he was in and kind of trying to wait for his blocks to set up, it always felt like those were the moments the offensive line faltered. So I think that what you saw in the national championship game was him deciding, I don't have to sit and be patient. I'm Donovan Edwards. I can look for a hole and then burst through it. I can bounce it. I can do whatever. And I think that maybe he learned that a little bit the week before, watching Blake do exactly that on the touchdown to essentially finish the game against Alabama. Because that's basically what Donovan did on that first touchdown run. So was run into the back of a guy and then bounce. And I think that kind of helps him kind of understand, like, I still have this in me, and I don't necessarily have to get the feel for the game to do it. I think where Michigan would be really smart this year, though, is to put as many options on the field as possible, because Donovan has the capability that we haven't seen a lot because he's gotten injured, being that receiver. And I think we all forget because last year he wasn't really utilized like this very often. But going into 2022, despite having Cornelius and Roman and some other guys that didn't really work out, like Darius Clemens, you still had Ronnie Bell on the team. People were talking about Donovan and going into 2022 as being the best receiver Michigan had on the team. Now, obviously, Colston Loveland tends to get that distinction, but Donovan has that capability. We saw against Penn State them putting Donovan and Kalel Mullings on the field at the same time. Imagine if you have Alex Orji as your quarterback and do exactly that. Because now you've got to you don't just have to defend all gaps in terms of, okay, who's, you know, they're going to hand off to the running back. What gap is he going to go through? Now you've got to defend all gaps and still stay true to the pass game, because the quarterback can run, but he can throw. Donovan can run, but he can catch it. You know, like they have all these different options. So I think that could even be a place where he could really excel. I've seen him do it. We saw him do it at Michigan. I've seen him do it at West Bloomfield. So I think that there's a lot of incredible things that you can do with him to give you the best chance to win. And that's where Michigan's offense can be particularly dynamic. And not to mention, even with that idea that I just threw out, you still have a Samaj Morgan who you could also put in motion. And there's just so many different things you can do just with the run game alone that could really open up things and make Michigan almost impossible to defend.
I think what we have to be very happy about is when Donovan needs a blow. Another thing I like is that we have some really good backs behind him. And you mentioned Kalel Mullings. We've seen samples of what he can do. I want to see him get the ball more in his hands this year. Love him. Love his blocking. But there are others, too, in that room. There's some really good young talent, isn't there?
Yeah, Benjamin Hall is going to be the guy. I think they didn't necessarily say he's the third back, but they basically said he's the third back.
Yeah.
And we've seen what he can do in the last 2 spring games. I mean, he's got a lower body that looks like, if you think about how big Chris Evans' legs were, I mean, Benjamin Hall makes his legs look like twigs. I mean, he's just got so much power in his lower half. And yet has speed and elusiveness, just hasn't gotten the opportunity. And he hasn't had the opportunity really at any level because he was a backup in high school. So he gives you power in kind of the same way, maybe more so than some of the other options you might have, even fullback and obviously Khalil Mullings. A lot of linebacker type bodies that can absolutely run. And Jordan Marshall, I think he looks a lot from a physical standpoint, and it seems like maybe from a mental standpoint, in the same kind of vein, like almost a mixture of Zach Charbonnet and Blake Corum. And Michigan's not ever really been afraid to play freshman backs, right? That then consecutive years, you saw Zach Charbonnet get the start, and then opening day the next year, Blake Corum oddly gets the start in that Minnesota game. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Jordan Marshall, Mr. Ohio football, get some run as well. I'm a little skeptical about some of the other guys. Is Cole Cabana, is he healthy, and is he ready to go? Tavier Dunlap has gotten a lot of mention from the coaches, but not really the media or the fan base. It's just he just feels like a guy that's kind of languishing, and then you just wonder if he's going to have the lights turn on. And then Micah Capana showed a lot at Powerhouse High School, Bishop Gorman. Definitely some game-breaking speed, but I feel like he might not necessarily be a guy that we see a lot of. Michigan has tended to want to kind of settle in with one or two guys, and obviously Donovan and Khalil Mullings are those two. But we'll see a little bit of another guy, but it's just a question of, can they come in? Can they be consistent? Can they take care of the football? Because that's usually what's derailed that third back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Khalil Mullings in 2022. That was what, from the spring game. And then, he was cross-training at linebacker and running back and fumbles in the spring game. And then it's like, okay, well, they'll only use him if in case of emergency. And then C.J. Stokes had fumbled in the Maryland game that year. And then it was like, okay, well, now Mullings is going to be our case of emergency guy. And they end up using him and ends up having the fumble issue again in the playoffs. And then, so like you all of a sudden had a couple guys like C.J. Stokes and Mullings that weren't necessarily used as often because of those issues. So it's going to be incumbent upon those guys who do come in as the third back to have the ball security. And as long as they have that, then they can probably continue to get consistent carries, because that's usually what ends up kind of taking the ball out of their hands, is when they let the ball out of their hands.
Well, let's move it over to the wide receiver position. Get your thoughts. Last year we had saw samples, I should say, of what Tyler Morris and Samaj Morgan could be at wideout. This year, they're going to be stepping up into the limelight. Do you like the potential for both of those guys?
I do. We've seen it in spurts, which I think is all you kind of need, especially in this offense, right? Because Michigan's they're not looking for guys to average 100 yards a game. They're just looking for, out of a group, who can have a hot hand enough, just who's going to give us enough. If we absolutely need it, who's going to be that guy that can go out and make a play? I think both have that capability. And yes, you want some more of the taller, rangier types usually to be that guy. But Samaj plays so much bigger than his size. You look back to his first touchdown when he against Rutgers. When the picture I have of him is like he's literally upside down in the air, like with a defensive back behind him. He can play a lot bigger than you would think for his size, and he's not lacking for confidence. And I think that the more that we can make Samaj a star in all facets and all ways, that's just good for college football. Get him on a microphone. I wish that there was a reality show that would just follow him around. He's my favorite. He's my absolute favorite, and I loved in being in Los Angeles for the Rose Bowl. I was at the same hotel as his dad and was running around downtown there, and would run into his dad. And I would be like, Samaj said this, and he'd just be like, my boy said what? He's just like It's just like that typical, like I know he's a loose cannon. I just hope that he stays under control. So it's interesting to see how he's grown, though, over the course of the year, where he went from being a guy who, started seeing the field a little early. Like I said earlier, wide receivers tend to be more year two guys.
Yeah.
And he ended up being kind of a core part of that offense. Maybe not as much as the others, obviously, but the lights really turned on for him more than anybody. And then we've been hearing about Tyler Morris since his freshman year. Lights didn't fully seem to turn on for him last year. He obviously had not only big play, the big touchdown against Alabama, but he had some big plays in that game and against Purdue and some others in maybe not Purdue, it was Bowling Green in the return game. Like we've seen that he's got that capability. So it's just a matter of him putting it to use more often, and I'm sure obviously that will equal more targets. You have to keep in mind with Michigan's wide receivers, and this is something I had to remind myself and tell myself, just because they don't have like those ringers that other teams have. Ohio State's going to go to a stable of a number of 5 stars, and you're like, okay, cool. That's going to work out for us one way or another because that's their focal point. Michigan has rolled out receivers that have otherwise been invisible in the college football landscape. 2016, Michigan was only lost 3 games by 5 combined points. Who were their wide receivers? Amara Darbo and Jehu Chesson. Not exactly guys that anyone was writing home about, but both were tall, rangy guys. Now, they don't necessarily have the tall, rangy guys that they're counting on to be their lead receivers. But even when you think about the last couple of years, you think 2021, Cornelius Johnson, no one, he was kind of in that boat of that guy's got some potential. We'll have to see it. And then Roman Wilson, who was injured for half the year. So I think back to even like the Nebraska game, and I'm like, how did they even throw the ball? Because they had Roman, they had Mikey Sainer still, and no, they didn't have Roman. Sorry, he was injured. They had Cornelius, they had Mikey Sainer still, and like Dalen Baldwin.
Yeah.
And obviously the tight end. So Michigan doesn't necessarily need those 5-star guys. They don't necessarily need those, super high-end wide receivers in order to make this offense go. So I think that with those 2 guys and then those others that I'm excited to see. Fred Moore. I talked about Kendrick Bell earlier, and bringing Amorian Walker back and bringing in C.J. Charleston from the transfer portal. I mean, they can get the job done with it. No, it's not going to be a group that anyone in college football is going to shudder with fear when they see them line up. But that doesn't mean that they can't produce.
Yeah, and I know a lot of our fans are in wait-and-see mode about the wide receivers, but that's okay. As you said, I think they're going to be just fine, too. But we're equally, I think, pumped up as a fan base about what Colston Loveland can be, and we're probably going to see him split out more this year at wide receiver or in the slot or whatever they want to do with him. There are some other emerging big-time talents in the tight end room, too, along with Colston, though, aren't there?
Yeah, Marlon Klein and Deacon Tonielli and Zach Marshall, obviously. Marlon's the guy that they say is the fastest tight end, and, it's the thing in the way Michigan's operated with the tight ends the last couple of years is they haven't really needed to go into the depth like you might. Colston was a special circumstance because as a true freshman, he was ready to go and was, basically the best they had. But generally, after, I don't know, Jake Butt, it kind of was like they've got a stable of tight ends. And, you didn't have to necessarily start using a Nick Eubanks until down the line or an Eric All until down the line. And yeah, they might get some early snaps and you hope that maybe they break out and become what Colston ended up becoming. But they've had consistency from that position group. There has not been a year where you felt like the tight ends were just not a focal point and underperforming in the offense. right? They've all along in the Jim Harbaugh era, whether it was Jake Butt, whether it was Sean McCune or Zach Gentry or Nick Eubanks or Eric All. I mean, maybe the Nick Eubanks, Eric All in 2020, that was maybe the part where it was like, okay, that's just not really quite up to par, but nothing was really up to par that year. But every other year, you've had some pretty good production from the position group. So the interesting thing with Colston, when you think about what Michigan is and what Michigan's trying to do, isn't it a lot like what Georgia is and what Georgia's tried to do? And it might look a little different now because Georgia's kind of starting to try to be in its, mid to late Saban era of, they've long had 5 stars and they're trying to get, better at the quarterback and the skill positions and such. But what Georgia has been in this championship run was incredibly strong defense, stellar offensive line, elite tight end. What does Michigan have? Those components, with Colston Loveland now being talked about the same way Brock Bowers was talked about. So Georgia didn't necessarily have a lot of wide receivers that anyone was like going nuts over. And even though like a guy like Ladd McConkey really ended up stepping up big time last year with Bowers' injury, that wasn't really the focal point for them. So I think that's where you can kind of build your offense. And I think what that does is having a Colston Loveland capable of what he's capable of, and he's going to garner a lot of attention. If Marlon Klein can show that he has the same hands, given his speed, then that opens up so many more opportunities for the offense as well. And a lot of people will look more so at the wide receivers and say, where's the pass production going to come from? But you have to keep in mind that a school like Michigan, like Georgia, your leading receiver might be a tight end, and that's 100% okay. And let's not even forget Max Bredesen, who technically fits into that group. I think you'll see him more, even in a typical tight end type package, instead of just being a fullback. He's in that room, and he has that capability. We've seen the spring game 2 years ago him catch a touchdown. I think that he's got that in his repertoire. We just haven't seen it yet. So I think that the group, it might not be the sexiest group. It might not be the thing that everyone's talking about, but certainly a good tight end can make a quarterback that is trying to get his sea legs suddenly start to look a lot better. So I can imagine that room is going to be heavily utilized, especially in some of those early tougher games that Michigan has.
If I have a concern, and it's really not a large concern, it's the kicking game. I mean, Tommy Doman, he's a stud punter. Not really worried at all about him. Place kicking, maybe a little bit of a worry until I see it in games. But Dominic Zaveda has been very good in camp from what we heard. We even saw some stats last week. He was, I think, 6 or 7 beyond the 50-yard mark. And you look at his career numbers, I think he's kicked 2 from 56 yards. And J.B. Brown seems to be very confident in him. Any worries for you in that kicking game?
No, I feel more confident in what they have in Dominic Zavada than I did with them having James Turner last year. I think he's much more consistent, has a bigger leg, just a little bit better, and more kind of Jake Moody than Quinn Nordine or James Turner. And so I think that bodes really well for Michigan. And there's a reason why they got him, obviously. I think I'd feel a little bit less good if it was Adam Tamaha, given like this was supposed to be his year, goes out in the spring game, misses an extra point. I mean, that was a glaring red flag. Not saying he's not going to be good, but like that's the moment where you can't do that. You know, it's like they want to see how the younger guys perform in front of a crowd in the big house, and that was a big epic fail. So Zavada has been consistent in his time at Arkansas State, and he's got that big leg. He's consistently been able to drill field goals. I think they're in a really good spot when it comes to that. That's a position where, honestly, once they got him and I started looking into him, it was like, okay, that's a set it and forget it for me. And I understand, like, when you're going from the consistency they had with Moody to they didn't really need James Turner that often last year. They're probably going to have to rely much more heavily on a kicker this year, just given that it isn't as experienced of a veteran group, and you question what the third down efficiency will be for this team compared to last year. So yeah, they're probably going to need him a little bit more. But to me, it's like I look at Zavada and I say that's about as good as it's going to get. So they should be in a pretty good position with him.
And as far as the punt and kick return piece of the game goes, plenty of options, but any guesses as to who we'll see on game day against Fresno State?
I would imagine you'll still see some Tyler Morris and Samaj Morgan, but as much as I want to make guesses, I feel like this is where I have a 0% hit rate on a year-over-year basis. Because every time even like if they mention a group of names in fall camp and say, yeah, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, I'm like, all right, those are the guys that we're going to see. I can literally just repeat back what they say. And then game one, I'll be like, oh, I didn't expect Kenneth Grant to be the guy returning kicks, right? Like, but they always seem to have like something up their sleeve on special teams. And now that they have a full-time special teams coordinator, I mean, that gives you even more sense of wonder when it comes to that. And obviously Michigan's prided itself at not having any negative returns when it comes to that. So I think that they'll be in good shape when it comes with whoever they pick. No more Jake Saw. I still feel bad for him because his entire reason for transferring was because he couldn't live with himself with that play in the Rose Bowl, in which I even told him directly. I said, you realize, like, yeah, you messed up first, but because you had your head on your shoulders and you went and you saved it. And I said, that's how Michigan fans see it. Like, if you don't have the wherewithal to get back on that ball, like, and you just gave up in that moment, you like, game's over, it's done. And he's like, yeah, I'm glad you see it that way. It's not how I see it. So they have some experience in Tyler and Samaj. I would imagine you're still going to see them. But I guess it will just be all about who's got the hands and the ability to track the ball. That's a lot harder than people think. Ooh, yeah. And that's kind of where they're looking for what they're looking for is guys that can do that. So I can't really put a prediction in place because whoever I say is going to be 100% wrong because that's just how it's gone for me every single year. So I'll stay with those two guys, and then probably they'll never be back there, and they'll end up being like a Marion Stewart and Shannon Goodwin or something like that.
Well, the good thing is we do have plenty of options, so we'll find out a week from Saturday who's back there. Final question before we let you get away, Isaiah. As we know, and we can't wait, next week the rubber meets the road, and it seems national and local analysts and beat writers, everyone who covers the team, pretty darn positive about Team 145 and the season. Are your expectations high, or are you hinging them on what kind of production we get at that quarterback position?
My expectations are high because I think that if you're a team that has 4 guys that are expected to go in the first round, that usually doesn't equate to a 9-3 team. That doesn't usually equate to an 8-4 team. So if you are getting that type of production, especially from your upperclassmen, the rising tide lifts all ships, and that's the rising tide. So I think that I look at it and say 10-2 or maybe 11-1, because Michigan should still be good at all of the things that Michigan has been good at, right? Like, I think that this is where people get they get a little reactionary, and usually a new team makes a playoff, wins a championship. It kind of doesn't matter what they lose. They're suddenly expected to be like the best ever for all eternity. And Michigan didn't really get that. And I understand they're still like a top 10 team. So it's not like people are necessarily writing them off entirely. and the schedule is obviously a lot harder. It'd be different if the schedule was what it was last year, and then you'd be like, okay, well, they've got time to figure this out. I think it helps a team like this Michigan team to have to be ready to go by week 2. So I think that this is, yes, a lot hinges on the quarterback. If the quarterback position isn't good, one player on the offensive line isn't good, it can sink the team, because we've seen great defenses squandered by inept offenses. I think that this will not be that. I do think that they've got enough pieces on offensive line that I don't mean to call this guy out, but they don't have to settle for a Nolan Ulizio, at right tackle. There isn't going to be a turnstile, because if someone goes out there and doesn't look that great in game, they have other options at most every position on the line. They've got dynamic players across the board. They've got team speed. They've got size on both lines. They have kind of a little bit of everything. What I think is missing from this team is obvious vocal leadership without a Mikey Sainristil or a Mike Barrett. But I think that they'll still have great team leadership from this cadre of juniors that are going to go out there, and from, a Donovan Edwards type who is certainly extremely vocal in his leadership. Might be different than what we've seen in the last couple of years, but I think it's just as galvanizing. So I think you add that to the fact that these guys that are stepping up, the next men up, saw what it took from the players that came before them. We're in the same weight room with them. We're in the same practices with them. We're sharing the same sideline, watching the same games. They saw everything it took to win a national championship. And I think that that's going to go a long way. So, yes, a lot will hinge on the quarterback. But Michigan, I'd like to kind of go back to what Joel Klatt said last week. Ohio State is bolstered at secondary. They're going to have a high-flying passing attack. They're trying to run the ball more. Will any of that matter if Michigan goes out and runs the ball 40 times a game? Because if your quarterback isn't working quite as you hope, you still have the capability with multiple backs, and even with Alex Orji, if he struggles to throw, he can still run. And having him and one or two guys in the backfield, along with the tight ends and stuff, it just, they can run to throw just as much as a lot of other teams throw to run. So I think that they'll definitely, I feel like, lose a game in the regular season this year, just because it isn't as much of a veteran group. But I think this team's as dangerous as anyone else in the country, and people just are overlooking it because new head coach, understandably, lost personnel, also understandably. But I just don't think that enough people are giving enough credit to the amount of talent. Because when it comes to this, when was the last time Michigan had 4 guys that are expected to go in the first round? I don't know that they ever have. And that's a difference. Usually you don't see that, Illinois was pretty good this year. They went 10-2 or 9-3 in the regular season, and they put 4 guys in, right? That never happens. It's usually like those teams that are, the 10-2s and 9-3s and 8-4s, they maybe put 1 guy in. Michigan won the championship last year and put 1 guy in. Most of Michigan's 10-2 type seasons, they put 1 or 2 guys in. 4, with the just group that they have and the culture that they have, to me that says, 10-2 is probably likely. 11-1 is possible. 12-0 feels impossible, but I wouldn't count it completely out.
Well, as I said, a week from this Saturday, the rubber meets the road, and we'll start to get some answers to some of those questions, and I know we all can't wait to do that. Here with us today to talk about all of that and the excitement has been Isaiah Hole from WolverinesWire. Isaiah, as always, very generous with your time. I know I appreciate it, as do my listeners, so we thank you once again for being with us and look forward, once we get into the season, to get you back on the show. So thank you.
Of course, my pleasure.
On Quick Hits today, up to this point, we have not been made aware of any injuries. I'm sure there are the usual bumps and bruises at this point in camp, but overall we seem to be in great health heading into game week for Fresno State. Next week we're back with 2 shows, as is the norm during the season. On Tuesday's Visitors Edition, we'll be joined by the radio play-by-play voice of Fresno State, Paul Leffler. On Thursday's Game Day show, we are scheduled to spend some time with the voice of our Wolverines, Doug Karsh, from the Michigan Football Network. So enjoy this last weekend, for many of us, the official end of summer. There are actually some really good games to watch this weekend as the college football season officially kicks off. That does it for now, though. Have a great Wolverine weekend, everyone. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Until we meet again, take care, and as always, go blue. Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!